In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, April 11th. Seoul and Washington reaffirmed the dedication to their alliance in the face of additional disclosure of alleged classified U.S. military documents that include a timeline of ammunition delivery from South Korea to an unspecified destination. Meanwhile, the Bank of Korea announces intentions to keep its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% in light of slowing inflation against the backdrop of a host of internal and external economic uncertainties. And neighboring Japan's most recently published annual diplomatic report fails to include the country's acknowledgement of past atrocities against Korea, but includes its false territorial claim over South Korea's Dokdo Island. Concerns continue to mount as more classified U.S. military documents are shared online, including a timeline about the delivery of ammunition by South Korea to an unspecified destination. Amid the latest developments, Washington has rejected the possibility of the rampant unauthorized disclosures disrupting its alliance with Seoul. Our Song Yoo-jin has the latest.
The United States says it is engaging with allies and partners regarding the recent leak of its highly classified military documents. The leak has been causing alarm around the world as some documents show the U.S. could have been eavesdropping on key allies like Israel and South Korea.
U.S. officials across the interagency are engaging with allies and partners at high levels over this, including to reassure them of our commitment to safeguarding intelligence and the fidelity of securing our partnerships as well.
When asked about how the leak could impact South Korea-U.S. relations, the spokesperson said Washington's commitment towards Seoul remains ironclad. He went on to emphasize that South Korea is one of Washington's most important partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Defense ministers of the two countries held a phone call on Tuesday morning at the request of the U.S., during which it promised close communication and cooperation with Seoul regarding the matter. But concerns are growing in South Korea as another document related to the country has been found online. On Monday, local media outlets reported on a printed document titled ROK 155 Delivery Timeline. The one-page document, dated February 27th, includes a 72-day timeline of when and how South Korea will deliver 330,000 artillery shells. Though it does not mention the final destination of the 155mm shells, a previously leaked conversation between President Yoon then Secretary for Foreign Affairs and his national security advisor suggests it could be Ukraine. Citing the leaked documents, the New York Times detailed the two advisors' conversation where the Foreign Affairs Secretary expresses concern that the U.S. would not be the end user if South Korea complies with its request for ammunition. In February, the U.S. had reportedly inquired about purchasing ammunition from South Korea, but Seoul was worried about supplies reaching Ukraine and going against its long-standing policy of not supplying weapons to countries at war. The National Security Advisor then suggested selling 330,000 rounds of 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine's neighbor Poland as a roundabout solution to the issue. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
Right, and those allegations of eavesdropping have raised concerns about secure communication within the top office building in Yongsan. Well, the presidential office has brushed aside these concerns and cast doubt instead on the authenticity of some of the alleged secret U.S. documents disclosed online. Our senior top office correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
South Korea's presidential office has dismissed concerns that the United States has been wiretapping the country's national security office. This follows media reports over alleged Pentagon documents leaked online. In a phone call with Yonhap News on Tuesday, a presidential official said eavesdropping and wiretapping of internal conversations at the top office building in Yongsan is impossible, saying that a highly stringent anti-wiretapping system was put in place when relocating from the Blue House last year. The official also brushed off concerns that the contents of National Security Office meetings held in the underground of the Yongsan building were compromised, drawing a line on whether a conversation between two senior personnel took place within the premises. This comes after classified documents seemingly leaked from the Pentagon were reported in US media. The documents appear to contain conversations between South Korean national security officials. The intelligence leak has stirred controversy over whether the US is wiretapping its allies, and comes over just 2 weeks before Yoon's summit with Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. Seoul's presidential office has maintained that the reports are unconfirmed and are likely to have been fabricated. It says discussions with the US and verification of the details should be prioritized.
Obviously, there's a red line. Every state has them. It accepts, spying and espionage even from friends and allies up to a certain point. But at some point, there's a sort of, unspoken code of conduct or an unspoken set of rules that states are supposed to follow. And I think South Korea, will want to reiterate that to the United States.
First Deputy Director of the National Security Office, Kim Tae-ho, told reporters on Tuesday that Seoul and Washington agreed there has been tampering of details in the documents, and the leak cannot be a variable in Seoul and Washington's relations. He said that since the two allies are closely engaged in information sharing, the crisis can be turned into an opportunity to solidify trust and strengthen the cooperation system between the two countries. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Also, on the diplomatic front, Japan's latest annual report on diplomacy makes no mention of the country's apologies for past atrocities here in Korea, as did its previous editions. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji explains.
Last month, the South Korean government announced its plan to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a public foundation, instead of through the Japanese firms found guilty by a South Korean court. At the time, Japan's foreign minister said he hoped the solution would help restore ties between the countries, and said the Japanese government will continue to uphold the apologies it made in the past.
On this occasion, we confirm that the Japanese government continues to uphold the stance on historical recognition made by previous cabinets as a whole, including the joint declaration between Japan and South Korea made in October 1998.
But this was not included in Japan's newly published Diplomatic Blue Book, an annual report on Japan's foreign policy and activities, released on Tuesday. Regarding the issue of compensating wartime forced labor victims, the report explained that Seoul and Tokyo have been discussing it since President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in May, through diplomatic channels and at the recent summit between the two countries' leaders. But the report did not explain the fact that Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi has said the Japanese government will uphold the stance made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration between South Korea and Japan in 1998. The joint statement in 1998 between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi includes Tokyo's, quote, deep remorse and heartfelt apology for causing tremendous damage and suffering to Koreans during its colonial rule. The latest report also said South Korea has continued an illegal occupation of Dokdo Island, which they refer to as Takeshima, with no legal basis. Japan has been saying this in its annual Diplomatic Blue Book for 6 years, since 2018. In response, South Korea's foreign ministry spokesperson said in a statement on Tuesday that Japan should immediately retract the unjust sovereignty claim to what is an integral part of South Korean territory, historically, geographically, and under international law. The ministry also called in Naoki Kumagai, the deputy chief of mission at the Japanese embassy in Seoul, to protest. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
South Korea has shared deep regret as North Korea remains unresponsive for the fifth day to routine cross-border communication via the liaison channel and the military hotline. In a televised statement on Tuesday, Seoul's Unification Minister Kwon Young-se found fault with Pyongyang for its unilateral and irresponsible action, adding that it would only serve to further isolate the regime. Kwon also condemned North Korea's use of South Korean facilities at the now-closed Kaesong Industrial Complex, underscoring the infringement of property rights as agreed under the broader joint accord over the complex. And North Korea's Kim Jong-un has reportedly ordered his military to ramp up war deterrence capabilities, according to the regime's state-run media on this Tuesday. Kim presided over a key military meeting that would be the day prior, during which he urged the need for practical and aggressive expansion of war deterrence. The report added that the meeting was convened in response to, quote, the aggressive acts and policies of South Korea and the US. Similar meetings were held in February as well as in March, and pundits are taking note of these developments as such meetings are reportedly held every 6 months or so. Seoul central bank is holding its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% amid slowing inflation and a host of uncertainties. Our finance correspondent Irresponsible reports.
The Bank of Korea has decided to freeze the key interest rate for now. The central bank announced the decision during Tuesday's Monetary Policy Committee meeting, keeping the base interest rate at 3.5%.
Considering inflation forecasts above the target level and financial risks expanding in major countries, we've decided to freeze the base rate and closely monitor the inflation slowdown and other economic uncertainties.
This is the second time in a row that the central bank has decided to keep the rate unchanged, with a 3.5% base rate in place for almost 3 months. Analysts say stabilizing consumer prices in South Korea was the main contributing factor behind the decision to freeze rates. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation, rose 4.2% on year in March, marking the slowest annual rise since March 2022. Worsening economic indicators, too, are mentioned as among the reasons for the central bank's decision. The country's GDP growth rate shrunk by 0.4% in the fourth quarter of last year, mainly due to sluggish exports. The balance of trade also recorded a deficit during the first 2 months of 2023, in the red for 2 consecutive months for the first time in 11 years. The global economic crisis caused by the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the liquidity crisis of Credit Suisse were also considered factors that stopped the BOK from imposing a rate hike. With the central bank's decision to hold the rate, the interest rate difference between South Korea and the U.S. stays at 1.5 percentage points. The last time the gap was so wide was 22 years ago and has sparked concerns that it could result in foreign capital outflow and a rise in the $1 exchange rate, leaving the possibility for more rate hikes in the near future. Lee-Hyun, Arirang News.
While the World Bank has raised its growth forecast for this year to 2% from its earlier projection of 1.7%, it has nonetheless joined the International Monetary Fund in raising concerns about geopolitical tensions and their broader impact on the global economy. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
With the World Bank's and International Monetary Fund's spring meetings kicking off on Monday, World Bank Group President David Malpass says the global lender has revised its 2023 global growth outlook slightly upwards. Speaking at a media briefing on the same day, Malpass says the World Bank revised its 2023 growth forecast from the previous 1.7% to 2%, mainly due to an improved outlook for China's recovery from COVID-19 lockdowns. The World Bank chief also noted that advanced economies like the U.S. and those in Europe are faring a bit better than the World Bank anticipated in their January Global Economic Prospects report. However, Malpass also warned that volatility in the banking sector and higher oil prices could yet again put downward pressure on growth prospects in the second half of 2023. He also noted that a slowdown from stronger 2022 global economic growth will increase debt distress for developing countries. During the session with Malpass and IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, the two chiefs pointed out that geopolitical conflicts, like the situation in Ukraine, are putting a heavy burden on the economy and trade. Georgieva went as far as to say that the division caused by geopolitical conflicts is one of the biggest challenges the world economy needs to solve. Malpass, on the other hand, raised concerns over developing countries, which have experienced capital outflows due to interest rate hikes. He also added that developing countries are suffering greatly from debt burdens, climate change, rising food prices, and slowing growth. Global economic issues will continue to be discussed during the 2023 spring meetings of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund, which takes place from April 10th to the 16th in Washington, D.C. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Back here in Korea, a hefty portion of the country's annual budget for research and development will be spent on 11 key industries, and the government is hoping to work with industry heavyweights to ensure a productive outcome. Our Moon Hae-ryun explains.
South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy held a roundtable on Monday with chief technology officers from 9 South Korean firms, including Samsung Display, Hyundai Motor and POSCO, to discuss investment plans for the year ahead. The government announced that it will be spending 70% of its annual budget for research and development across 40 different projects in 11 key investment areas. Those being semiconductors, displays, secondary batteries, future mobility, core materials, advanced manufacturing, robots, aerospace and defense, advanced bio, next-generation nuclear power, and new energy industries. The ministry explained that the public and private sectors will be working together to establish clear goals and investment directions for each sector and focus their investment on selected strategic projects. In the past, the government faced criticism for its unclear approach to investments in research and development, but through collaboration with the private sector, it hopes that it will be able to invest wisely. Furthermore, a project manager group will be formed to manage the process of technological development, commercialization, and talent development. With the slump in the semiconductor industry amid falling semiconductor prices and the economic slowdown affecting exports, the government plans to invest in 4 semiconductor projects to revitalize the industry. These include developing semiconductors for mobility, energy, and home appliances, as well as pursuing semiconductor technology development projects for autonomous vehicles. As of Monday, the government has identified 34 projects to invest in. This will later be expanded to 40 projects after further consultation with experts. 문혜련, Arirang News.
Firefighters are racing against time to put out a wild blaze in the mountains of Gangneung City on the country's east coast that began Tuesday morning. The Korea Forest Service has since raised its wildfire response alert to its highest level of 3. More than 300 people have been evacuated and at least 40 houses and other infrastructure have been burnt. Now, President Yoon Suk-yeol has called for an all-out effort to extinguish the fire as soon as possible. And today, that is April 11, Korea marks its 104th anniversary of the founding of the Korean Provisional Gov't. A commemorative event was held at Seoul Independence Park here in Seoul. Some 400 people took part, including the families of independence fighters. The Korean Provisional Gov't was formed in April 1919, shortly after the March 1st movement and its related protests. The provisional body played a key role in Korea's independence movement against Japanese colonial rule until the country's liberation 27 years later. More relevant information can be found in the metaverse via a platform recently unveiled by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs. The platform is called Jong-un and can be accessed from the National Memorial of the Korean Provisional Gov't website. Fountains along Seoul's Hangang River will light up the capital city with colors and music after sunset. According to the Seoul Metropolitan Government, the Banpo Bridge Rainbow Fountain and the Yeouido Park Floating Fountain have been in operation since April 1st. But 8 more fountains spanning the river, including one at Nanjin Hangang Park, are also set to join the nocturnal lighting event starting in May. And 2 more, including the Tuksam Park water screen, will open in July. For more information on the locations and operating hours of the fountains, visit the Seoul Hangang Park headquarters website.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the United States, at least 4 people have been killed and 9 wounded in a mass shooting at a bank. The shooting happened in the state of Kentucky in Louisville on Monday local time. 3 of the wounded are in critical condition. The gunman was using a rifle and was shot and killed by responding police officers. He was identified as a 23-year-old bank employee who had recently found out he would be fired. He is said to have left a note to family and friends, suggesting his intention to carry out the shooting and live-streamed the attack. Kentucky passed a law in March prohibiting its state and local authorities from enforcing any federal restrictions related to firearms. Turning over to the war in Ukraine, Kyiv and Moscow have exchanged over 200 troops in the latest prisoner swap. According to both countries, the swap took place on Monday local time, but it's not known how it was carried out. It saw 100 Ukrainian and 106 Russian soldiers returned home. Officials from both sides say that their soldiers are in bad shape and are being treated for injuries and receiving rehabilitation. Ukrainian officials allege that some of their troops were also tortured, while Russian officials say their servicemen were in mortal danger in Ukrainian captivity. Meanwhile, in France, 5 bodies have been pulled from the rubble of a collapsed building in the city of Marseille amid ongoing search and rescue efforts. 3 people are still missing. The building came down after an explosion on Sunday morning local time, which authorities say was likely caused by a gas leak. The explosion also damaged nearby buildings, causing 2 to partially collapse a few hours later. Initial rescue efforts were hampered by dust and heat from the fire, which took a crew of 100 firefighters hours to extinguish. The disaster marks the second time in 5 years that a building has collapsed in the port city. In November 2018, 8 people were killed when 2 houses collapsed due to structural issues. And finally, Sky News Australia is quitting TikTok. The news outlet reported on Monday that it would stop publishing videos on its account, leaving behind its 65,000 followers. It cited security concerns as the main reason, alleging that the platform takes data from its users. It comes after TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, fired 4 employees in December 2022 for accessing the personal data of 2 journalists working for the Financial Times and BuzzFeed. TikTok has already been banned from official devices used by employees of several governments and organizations over allegations the app is controlled by Beijing. But TikTok maintains that the Chinese government has no control over the app. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's amazing to see how weather patterns can switch so quickly in just a day, from fine spring weather to a typhoon-force windy day. A wind advisory has been issued in the east and west coast regions as well as the capital area. In fact, the mountainous regions in Gangneung province are seeing violent gale-force winds of 110 kilometers an hour. While it could be difficult to stand without holding onto something, and even cars will not be able to drive at normal speed. And along with violent winds, rain is soaking the nation. Try not to get wet by today's rainfall. It is very likely that rain will be mixed with yellow dust today. A strong umbrella is a must, or have your raincoat ready to avoid that dusty rain. Daily highs are slightly lower in central regions, but going up as high as Monday in southern parts of the country. After the rain, colder air moves into the country, dragging down the morning temperatures to just 5 degrees Celsius here in the capital tomorrow, about 10 degrees lower than this morning. Then another band of rain is in the forecast between Friday and Saturday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Right, and on that note, we say goodbye. We have our daily panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us.
Busan, Korea is already reaching the entire world, like ocean waves that travel far and wide. It's Busan, the perfect World Expo city, transforming our world, navigating toward a better future.
Ireland, like Korea, is a very outward-facing country. Our peoples are curious about the world. Like Irish people, it matters to Koreans that your story is told well, that people understand your values, your culture, your perspectives. Arirang plays a really important role in telling Korea's story to the world and to promoting the Korean brand. This fosters closer friendships between Korea and other countries and enables better cooperation. Resonating with the world, Arirang.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
This year, we mark the 104th anniversary of the establishment of the Korean Provisional Gov't in Shanghai during Japan's colonial rule of Korea. So what led to the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government beyond national borders? How did ethnic Koreans in Hawaii support Korea's fight for independence? And what are the implications of Seoul's campaign to seek out Korea's independence fighters? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we take a short walk into Korea's history and its fight for independence, as April 11th marks the anniversary of the Korean Provisional Government that was set up in Shanghai back in the year 1919. For more, I have Professor Emeritus Edward Schultz, who is also the head of the Korea American Foundation over in Hawaii. Professor Schultz, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure.
Right, here in the studio I also have Kwon Soa, as always. Soa, welcome back.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, so let's start with some background information regarding the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai in the year 1919.
Yes, so the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea was established on April 11th, 1919, just shortly after the March 1st movement in the same year in response to Japan's colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula. Now, more people might be familiar with 삼일절, or the March 1st movement, day where the proclamation of independence was made by a group of 33 leaders in Seoul, and that led to nationwide uprisings. Not only within the country, but the presence of freedom fighters grew overseas as well, such as in China, Russia, and the US, with the realization that there were limitations to what protesters could do in Korea amid Japan's brutal crackdowns. It was also outside the country, in Shanghai, China, where the Korean Provisional Government was established, which became the center of resistance against Japan's suppression from its establishment, as I said, in April 1919 until August 1945, when Korea was liberated and the Provisional Government was dissolved. Leading members of the Korean Provisional Government included Lee Seung-man, who later became the first president of the Republic of Korea, An Chang-ho, and Kim Gu. Now, the Provisional Government introduced a presidential system and three branches of the government: the legislative, administrative, and judicial branches. The government in exile, how it is often referred to as, although some historians say it shouldn't be called that way, introduced the first democratic republic in the history of Korea from what in the past was monarchies, and it played a pivotal role in shaping modern Korea. The official name, Republic of Korea, also stemmed from the Provisional Government, and what Articles 1 and 2 of the Republic of Korea's Constitution says today, that the Republic of Korea's sovereignty lies with the people and all authority comes from the people, are all present in the Provisional Government's Constitution, written more than 100 years ago.
Right. Also, so prior to the year 2019, we commemorated this particular day on April 13th. Could you explain this change in date for us?
Right. The foundation date of the Provisional Government was designated as April 13th back in 1989 and was commemorated on that day until year 2018, which was the 99th anniversary. However, historians have been suggesting the correction of the date following years of collective research that found the actual foundation of the Korean Provisional Government falls on April 11th, when the Provisional Charter was enacted. This is a happening that occurred due to the existence of different sources of documents, with the accuracy of some of them not deemed reliable, according to experts. So after sufficient evidence was found, the government decided to adjust the foundation date to April 11th, 1919, and with that, in year 2019, marking the 100th anniversary, it was held on the 11th for the first time.
Right, I see. And now, Professor Schultz, what can you tell us about the ethnic Koreans there in Hawaii who sought to support the fight for Korea's independence?
The Koreans first came to Hawaii in 1903, and this is just before the Japanese took over Korea. And the immigration lasted from 1903 to 1905, and when the Japanese took over, they then basically shut down any more Korean immigration. All in all, roughly 7,000 Koreans immigrated from Korea to Hawaii, and this is over the period from roughly 1903 to 1920. And at that time, basically 90% of Koreans in the United States were living in Hawaii. And when they came, initially it was just men, or overwhelmingly men. And then as time progressed, they started what they call the picture brides. And these are women who sent their pictures over and then came to join and get married to men here in Hawaii. And what all of these people are doing is often they were living on plantations, and they had very hard labor. It was out hot in the sun, and many of them were initially from fairly urban backgrounds, and so they really weren't made as farmers, but they quickly adjusted themselves to living on the farms. And they also became very, very much aware of Korea's loss of sovereignty. And everybody, as Korean immigrants came, every year they would have new stories of woe of what's happened to Korea. Then, of course, in 1910, Korea was extinguished. And yet, all of them carried a great love for their country and a great desire to try to reestablish Korea's independence. And this became very much a product of life in Hawaii from basically 1903 up until the end of the Korean War, and end of the World War II in 1945. So living in a pressure cooker, working hard, and yet really bitterly suffering from the loss of their country's sovereignty. They really bonded together and said, we have to do something. We have to support our country.
Right, I see. Professor Schultz, I understand your foundation itself, it's also actively engaged in a tombstone rubbing project that is facilitating the task of identifying former independence activists. Could you explain this project for us?
Sure. Every year, the Korean American Foundation holds a ceremony out at a cemetery on the North Shore. And last year, the KBFD producer, that's our local TV producer, suggested we start a tombstone rubbing in which, and there you see a picture of basically this particular cemetery, in which we gathered together a number of different people, basically community people, to try to search out the tombstones of the independence fighters. And throughout the summer, they went and collected these rubbings, and essentially they gathered roughly 60 rubbings altogether of patriots. And there you see one gentleman who's doing an actual rubbing. And at the end of this project, and by the way, it was not only Jung Tae Lee from KBFD TV, but also Ducky Lee Moribayashi, who is the head of the Korean American Historical Institute, who really became the linchpins behind this particular project. Altogether, as I say, they gathered roughly 60 of these rubbings, and then we initially displayed them in Hawaii, as you can see right from that particular picture, and then we took them over to the Independence Hall in Daejeon, or Cheonan, and gave these rubbings to the Independence Hall, and they're now under the custody of Independence Hall. But all in all, it was a community-wide project. It lasted the whole year of 2022 with the idea of being one more way to commemorate our 120th anniversary of Korean immigration this year, 2023.
Right, a remarkable project, if I may say so myself. And so also here in Korea, the campaign to bring home the remains of Korea's independence fighters buried abroad, that is, continues. Right, tell us a bit about that.
Right, so such efforts do continue throughout the year, but remains of independence fighters are often brought home on meaningful occasions, such as around March 1st Independence Movement Day and the anniversary of the foundation of the Korean Provisional Gov't. So the latest remains that returned home just yesterday or Monday are those of Korean independence fighter Hwang Ki-hwan, who died almost exactly 100 years ago in New York. His remains arrived at Incheon International Airport Monday morning, and a repatriation ceremony was held, attended by Veterans Minister Bang Min-sik and descendants of independence fighters. His remains were then laid to rest at the National Cemetery in Daejeon. Now, Sunny, I have a question for you. Have you watched Mr. Sunshine?
I actually have.
Oh, really? I actually haven't
back.
yet. Oh, I see.
So beautiful drama series.
Then
Lee played the role.
Exactly. Then you might be familiar that the story of Hwang Ki-hwan actually was depicted in the 2018 hit series. And he was known as Yoo-jin Choi in the drama. So Hwang was born in Suncheon, South Pyongan province in 1886, which is now in North Korea, and then moved to the U.S. in 1904. He fought for the U.S. in World War I, during which he was stationed in France. He then stayed in France and fought for Korea's independence. In 1921, Hwang served as a member of the Korean Provisional Government's diplomatic mission in London, and he also made numerous publications. He died at the early age of 37 of a heart disease in New York. Now, it took 10 years for the activist's remains to be returned to Korea. This, as the Suncheon-born Hwang, as I mentioned earlier, had no official family registration here. Following years of efforts, Korea now was able to give posthumous Korean nationality to the independence activist and bring him home. Korea's government is continuously seeking to repatriate heroes like Hwang by receiving approval from local governments, because many of these, because they are already buried at cemeteries there, it needs approval from the government cemeteries and also local courts as well overseas.
Right, and keeping in mind what Soa has just said, Professor Schultz, what do you believe are the broader implications of Korea's relentless campaign of seeking out its independence fighters for their descendants?
I think we have to realize the first half of the last century was really hard for Korea. They lost their sovereignty, then they had a war that divided the country, and really Korea was just surviving, just barely surviving as it lost, as I say, as it was on the verge of being taken over. And yet, Koreans didn't give up. They continued to carry the love for their country. They continued to find ways in which to support their kingdom, or their provisional government. And I think in this respect, the independence fighters are really models for all of us. All of us, when we face issues of citizenship, issues of fighting for democracy, these folks didn't give up. They continued to work on, and I think it behooves all of us to find inspiration from just ordinary people, common people, not kings, not queens, not presidents, not senators, just ordinary citizens who took it upon themselves to try to defend what they believed was their birthright, what they believed was their country that was being seriously damaged.
Right, indeed. Selfless sacrifices by these very ordinary people. And also, these ordinary people's plight, so back in history, the U.S. media played quite a role in bringing to light the plight of these Koreans, especially also raising awareness about Japan's atrocities on the Korean Peninsula. Could you briefly tell us about that?
Exactly. The U.S. and Western media covered the events of the uprisings on the Korean Peninsula with a great deal of empathy and fervor, although it took around 2 weeks for many of them to really get a grasp of the situation and start reporting on the March 1st and following events. Now, American media covered the independence movement on their headlines, be it on national or local newspapers. For instance, the New York Times on March 13th titled an article, "Koreans declare for independence. Thousands who engage in demonstration are arrested by the Japanese." And also a headline by the Washington Post on March 15th, 1919, said, "Girls' hands cut off. Atrocity by Japanese soldiers reported by Koreans. Seoul outbreak subsides." It described the independent movement as a national one with 3 million adherents, most of them being students, and reported on the tens of thousands arrested and tortured. And as the title says, reported on the atrocity of Japanese soldiers who cut off a girl's hand holding a copy of the Independence Manifesto in one hand. As she raised her other hand, it was cut off too. And also the Honolulu-based Pacific Commercial Advertiser, now the Honolulu Advertiser, covered the movement extensively as well, including on March 15th, carrying an article that said, "Koreans' independence movement growing. Washington hears many dead and jailed as a result of revolt, ultimate freedom from Japan sought. And later on March 20th, one article said, Koreans assert independence. Now, not only did these media abroad, like in the U.S., play a big role, but of course also, again, the Korean freedom fighters themselves overseas played a significant role as they were raising the awareness around the world, and they were also featured in a lot of interviews in such medias abroad.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Schultz, do tell us a bit about the campaign in Hawaii of seeking out the descendants of Korea's independence fighters and honoring them with house nameplates, I think. What was behind this particular campaign, and what has been the response from the recipients?
Well, actually, we started a whole plaque project about 10 years ago in which we tried to commemorate important historical sites here in the islands to the Korean community. The Korean community today is roughly 50,000 people, and it's not terribly large, and yet Koreans are very active in the community. And so what we decided to do, in addition to this plaque project, general plaque project, is to go to various homes and give this plaque that you see right here, a home for the descendants of Korean independence fighters. And we went to, actually on March 1st this year, we went to we picked 3 families, and we went to them, and they erected their plaques. And here you can see them. But even before, when we had our major centennial 120th anniversary on January 13th, we did find people who were descendants and gave them likewise plaques. So altogether, we've given out perhaps 30 plaques. We hope to, let me correct that. We gave out 30 plaques on January 13th when we celebrated our 120th anniversary. And then we've been in the process of giving out more plaques. Altogether, we have given out roughly 70 plaques to various families. And all of them are tickled. They're very happy about it. And they also know that this is a great message for their descendants, just as they're commemorating their grandparents and their parents. Now their children will be able to have a greater appreciation for what Korean independence fighters did for their country.
Right, indeed. And staying with that campaign, South Korea, for its part, also traced the descendants of 6 Hawaii-based independence fighters. What more can you tell us about that?
Right, Korea identified the descendants of 6 independence activists last year whose endeavors in the fight against Japan's colonial rule were made in Hawaii. The Veterans Affairs Ministry had launched a project to locate descendants of activists who contributed to the independence movement there in a bid to honor them properly with state benefits. Researches of old documents, newspaper articles, meetings with officials in Hawaii and etc. were used in finding these. Now, among the descendants were George Blair McCune, the grandson of George S. McCune, who was an American who won the Order of Merit for a National Foundation in 1963 for contributing to the Koreans' independence movement. And there was also Elsa Carl, the great-granddaughter of Dora Moon. Moon took part in the first organization of Korean women in Hawaii in 1913. Willa Chung, her daughter, helped as well by raising funds along with other Korean women. And an official at the Veterans Affairs Ministry said last year, quote, the identification of the descendants carries significant meaning given that it sheds new light on Hawaii-based independence fighters who financially supported their country's independence and the activities of its provisional government.
Right. Professor Schultz, this year marks the 120th anniversary of Korean immigration to Hawaii. And I understand celebrations were held back in January to commemorate the arrival of the first ship of Koreans into the island. That being said, what is on the agenda for the rest of this year?
Well, actually, our Consul General brought us all together roughly a year ago and said, hey, we have to do some big things in 2023. That's when our 120th was. And as you mentioned, we had major commemorations on January 13th and several other dates right around that time. Now, for the rest of the year, we will continue to beat the drums and remind people that Koreans are important in Hawaii. Koreans are integral to Hawaii. And you may well know that our Lieutenant Governor is a Korean American. And that's certainly given us added prestige as a separate community. But the first big thing will be on July 25th. We go to Punchbowl Cemetery and we commemorate the veterans who gave their life to help defend Korea during the Korean War. Then in August, mid-August, we have what we call the Korea Festival, and the Korean Chamber of Commerce becomes the major sponsor for that. And this is a picnic, basically a big picnic in which we have Korean dance, we have photo shops, photo exhibits, eating contests, any number of different events occur. And then as we get into the autumn, we have Hangal celebrating Korean script on October 9th. And we also will have later in the year some golf tournaments and other sports events. And then towards the end of the year, we have a special soju drinking contest, I understand. I'm not quite sure if I'll participate in that, but there are all sorts of events throughout the year. And then, of course, when 2024 comes, we once again celebrate 121st anniversary Korean immigration to Hawaii and the United States.
Right, and the celebration continues, of course. Good to know, good to know. So back here in Korea, on a rather somber note, though, what can you share with us about the lives of some of the descendants of Korea's independence fighters?
Sunny, while while honoring their grandfathers and grandmothers' deeds, or their great-grandfather or great-grandmother's deeds, and never losing their pride for these acts, quite a number of descendants agree with the Korean saying that says 독립운동을 하면 3대가 망한다. That was basically saying if you took part in independence movements, 3 generations will end up poor. Despite the government's efforts in raising the level of recognition and support for independence fighters and their descendants, the reality is that many of them are struggling to make ends meet. According to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs in 2018, 66% of freedom fighters recognized as patriots by the ministry had no income, and among those who had jobs, only a minority had stable jobs, and also 76% had chronic illnesses. And also a dilemma is that children and grandchildren of these independence fighters are facing is that not all of their stories are known to the public. So there are high-profile independence fighters' descendants who are living decent lives, while there are also many unsung heroes that deserve the same treatment by the community and government. And according to experts, many of the freedom fighters' families are hesitating in talking about their economic situation because they are afraid that their ancestors' legacy could be dented by doing so.
I see. Well, that remains a task to be tackled by the government, I suppose. All right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition, I believe. So, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Schultz over in Hawaii, thank you so much for your insights today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Tomorrow, that is Wednesday, we highlight the latest events within the K-pop industry. Join us then.
Stories on site. From Korea to the world, and from the world to Korea. We ask questions every day that could change the world. Taking news a step further, Arirang News. You're watching Arirang News. You're watching Arirang.